A haunting discovery in 1848. In the autumn of 1848, a demolition crew in Salem, Massachusetts stumbled upon something so disturbing that it would forever alter the town's relationship with its past. The site was the long-abandoned St. Mary's Academy for Young Ladies, a once revered institution that had stood silent for decades, its windows like the hollow eyes of a forgotten spectre. As workers began dismantling the chapel, they pried up the creaking floorboards to reveal a strange lead-lined box. The box, sealed tightly as if meant to never be found, was heavy with the weight of something more than just metal. Inside, resting atop each other like condemned testimonies, were 47 leather-bound journals. Each bore a name, different girls, different stories, all written in a trembling, youthful hand. But what united them was their content, chilling, precise accounts of pain, confusion, and betrayal. These weren't teenage ramblings or innocent musings. They were vivid recollections of psychological torment, physical degradation, and ceremonial violations conducted under the guise of spiritual discipline. Most alarming to those who examined the materials weren't just the graphic entries, but the records kept alongside them, meticulous logs of dates, behaviors, dosages, and most damning of all, names. These names weren't random. They were recognizable. Dozens of them belonged to the elite of New England judges, senators, ministers, and businessmen whose legacies were etched into the very fabric of regional history. Some buildings still bore their names. Some descendants still held office. The documents connected them without ambiguity to a hidden enterprise that preyed on vulnerable girls behind the veil of morality. Faced with the explosive implications, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts made a swift and unprecedented decision: seal the records. For over a century, they remained locked away in a classified archive marked with a vague justification: public safety concerns. It wasn't until a dying woman's confession in 1907, a woman who had once been a student at the academy, that whispers began to re-emerge, nudging historians, journalists, and investigators to reconsider what had been buried. What you're about to read or witness is not folklore or dramatized fiction. It's a reconstructed account, drawn from hidden testimonies, illegally duplicated documents, and voices that were never meant to be heard. It is a tale of corrupted power cloaked in virtue of children offered up as sacrifices on the altar of social respectability. This is not just a story about what happened in Salem. It is a story about what can happen anywhere when unchecked authority converges with apathy. And it is not for the faint-hearted. If you have ever questioned the mask of righteousness worn by the powerful, or wondered how institutions once celebrated could conceal such darkness, then this journey is for you. But be warned, once you begin to see behind the curtain, you may never look at virtue the same way again. The rise of St. Mary's Hope masked in virtue. In the early years of the 19th century, Salem, Massachusetts remained haunted by shadows from its infamous past. Though over a century had passed since the witch trials of 1692, the city's reputation as a place where hysteria, once masqueraded as justice, still lingered in the American consciousness. Determined to reinvent itself as a beacon of enlightenment and moral integrity, Salem's leading families sought opportunities to recast the town's image. They envisioned a city that honored learning, religious conviction, and the refinement of character. Into this social climate of ambition and penitence arrived the Fairfax family, aristocratic, well-educated, and as it would first appear, deeply virtuous. At the center of this reinvention was Victoria Fairfax, a widow of commanding presence whose name would soon become synonymous with moral authority in Salem. She arrived in 1811 carrying both a southern gentility and the gravitas of European education. A woman of striking stature and piercing steel-gray eyes, Victoria had once moved through the drawing rooms of Philadelphia and London as both scholar and socialite. She had endured personal tragedy, her husband, Dr. Cornelius Fairfax, having succumbed to yellow fever in Charleston, but rather than retreat into mourning, she channeled her grief into a mission to elevate the moral and intellectual standing of young women who, like herself, had known sorrow and hardship. Victoria announced her plan to open St. Mary's Academy for young ladies with solemn clarity and philanthropic flair. She would offer a sanctuary for girls, especially those orphaned, impoverished, or otherwise forgotten by society. It would be a place where character virtue and intellectual discipline were cultivated in equal measure. But it was not to be a charity alone. St. Mary's would also cater to the daughters of Salem's elite, who would pay handsomely for the opportunity to have their girls educated in an environment of dignity and Christian refinement. This dual structure allowed the institution to present itself as both benevolent and prestigious, a beacon of class unity under the shared banner of moral instruction. The townspeople welcomed the initiative with enthusiasm, particularly the religious and civic leaders who saw in Victoria a kindred spirit. She spoke their language, discipline, order, propriety, but with a genteel elegance that elevated her above the common missionary. Her proposal to integrate the poor and the privileged under one moral roof seemed to the local clergy nothing short of revolutionary. Here was a woman who promised salvation not through sermons alone, but through structured education, artistic cultivation, and Protestant piety wrapped in lace and scripture. The property she selected only added to the mythos. It was an imposing Georgian mansion on a beacon hill, long abandoned and rumored to be cursed. That Victoria would choose such a location, once the home of merchant Samuel Hartwell and left derelict after a series of unexplained events, was interpreted not as folly, but as courage. She declared the building's haunted history a relic of Catholic superstition, and set about transforming it into a citadel of Protestant virtue. Chapel wings were added stained glass depicting saintly women adorned the sanctuary, and a third floor was reserved for meditative solitude. To the people of Salem, St. Mary's Academy represented hope and rebirth. In the wake of a shameful history and amid the moral uncertainties of a new century, the town needed a symbol of redemption. Victoria Fairfax offered one wrapped in velvet, gilded with scripture, and cloaked in the sweet scent of rosewater and incense. What no one yet realized was that beneath this elegant exterior, a different legacy was being prepared, one that would not elevate the soul, but consume it. The triumvirate, Victoria, Evangeline, and Bartholomew. Behind the noble facade of St. Mary's Academy stood a trio whose seemingly righteous intentions concealed a chilling orchestration of control. Victoria Fairfax, the widowed matron of the institution, was not alone in her mission to shape young women into paragons of moral virtue. She was joined by two key family members who would become the other pillars of what locals soon revered as the Fairfax Triumvirate. Together, they commanded absolute authority over the lives, minds, and bodies of the students entrusted to their care. In the eyes of the community, Their presence added legitimacy, structure, and moral balance to the academy. In truth, it cemented a hierarchy that would silence questions, enforce obedience, and eventually carry out an operation of unspeakable abuse, cloaked in the language of God. Evangeline Fairfax, Victoria's younger sister, was a study in contradictions. She was delicate, soft-spoken, and emotionally reserved. Her prematurely gray hair and trembling hands gave the impression of a woman long acquainted with fragility. She attributed her condition to a childhood fever, a narrative that garnered sympathy and reverence in equal measure. Yet despite her physical weakness, Evangeline was the soul of St. Mary's musical and cultural education. She possessed a rare talent for the piano and an angelic soprano voice that filled the Academy's chapel with haunting beauty. During services, her hymns carried such ethereal resonance that passers-by were known to pause outside the school just to listen. Girls idolized her for her artistry, and the community praised her as a symbol of divine gentleness. But the same trembling voice that brought tears to hardened sailors would also be heard echoing in sinister late-night ceremonies few would ever forget. The third figure in this sacred triangle was Bartholomew, Fairfax Victoria's brother-in-law, and the Academy's chaplain. Where Evangeline exuded fragility, Bartholomew projected unyielding strength. Tall, gaunt, and hollow-cheeked, he spoke in measured tones that inspired both awe and dread. His sermons, delivered with the fervor of a fire-and-brimstone preacher, warned of a modern world steeped in corruption and of Satan's special interest in tempting young women. His words painted a stark moral landscape where innocence was easily corrupted, and redemption could only be found through rigorous submission to divine authority. To the parents of the Academy's students, this unrelenting message of protection and spiritual discipline was oddly reassuring. It made them feel as if their daughters were safe from moral decay, watched over by a man who understood the stakes of eternal damnation. The trio complemented one another perfectly. Victoria was the commanding intellect and public face, diplomatic, sophisticated, and respected. Evangeline was the emotional anchor, the soft voice that soothed troubled girls and projected a maternal innocence. Bartholomew was the enforcer of ideology, a spiritual gatekeeper who stood as both shepherd and sentinel. Together, they created an ecosystem of moral absolutism that allowed no space for doubt or dissent. Within the hallowed halls of St. Mary's, their presence ensured that every lesson, every prayer, every rule was imbued with divine purpose. To the world outside the Fairfax family was a symbol of nobility and sacrifice. But to those behind the Academy's stone walls, they were both saviors and captors. Their combined charisma and authority made escape physical or psychological almost unthinkable. And under their watch, the line between spiritual formation and systematic subjugation would blur, then vanish entirely. The first victims, hope meets horror. When the doors of St. Mary's Academy opened on September 15, 1811, the ceremony was one of reverent celebration. Autumn leaves danced across the cobblestone courtyard as Salem's most esteemed citizens gathered to witness what they believed was the beginning of a new moral epoch. The mayor gave a speech. Clergy offered prayers. Victoria Fairfax, standing on the marble steps in a flowing black silk gown, addressed the crowd with measured eloquence, invoking scripture and ideals of virtue. She promised not just education, but redemption, a place where young ladies would be nurtured in intellect, character, and godliness. For many in attendance, it was a vision too good to question. Yet among the applause and hymns, no one thought to ask what exactly lay behind the stained glass windows, or what fate awaited the girls who would call this academy their home. The first class consisted of 23 students between the ages of 12 and 17. Some were daughters of wealthy families attired in fine wool dresses, escorted by polished carriages, their tuitions paid in full. But more than half were charity cases, orphans and children of poverty, whose presence was used to illustrate the academy's benevolence. These were the girls most vulnerable, most eager to believe that anyone had finally come to rescue them. 3 among them would later become names forever associated with the darkness of St. Mary's: Margaret Sullivan, Priscilla Morse, and Hannah Whitmore. Margaret Sullivan was just 14 when she arrived. Her parents, Irish immigrants, had perished in a tenement fire during the previous winter. She had spent months working grueling shifts in a textile mill, her hands raw from chemicals, and her spirit slowly eroding. So when a representative of the academy offered her a place complete with room, board, and education, she believed it to be a miracle. She accepted without hesitation, her green eyes wide with hope, her red hair a banner of youth not yet dulled by the realities she would soon face. Priscilla Morse was 15, the daughter of a sailor lost at sea, and her mother dead from tuberculosis. She had been living with an embittered uncle who barely acknowledged her presence. Her quiet demeanor, dark eyes, and love for books marked her as a contemplative soul. When she stepped onto the academy's grounds, she did so with reverence. For Priscilla, a library was more sacred than a chapel, and the promise of learning was a light in an otherwise bleak world. And then there was Hannah Whitmore, perhaps the most tragic of all. Just 13, her father had been imprisoned for theft, and her mother had vanished without explanation. She'd been living in the Salem poorhouse, her cheeks hollow, her voice barely above a whisper. When Victoria Fairfax visited in person and offered her a place at St. Mary's, Hannah looked at her as if an angel had descended. She would finally have a bed of her own meals that came on time and the chance to read stories rather than survive them. These girls and others like them entered the academy with gratitude in their hearts and dreams in their minds. They were told they were safe. They were told they were special. They were told they were chosen by God. But what they didn't know was that St. Mary's was not a sanctuary, but a stage, not a school, but a theater of cruelty. And they, the innocent performers, were being groomed not for a future of light, but for rituals that would shatter their bodies, steal their voices, and leave their names whispered only in horror. The seamstress witness. Mrs. Thornton's silent alarm. Sometimes it is those furthest from power who see the truth first. Mrs. Abigail Thornton was not a member of Salem's elite. She was not educated in any academy, nor did she dine with clergymen or lawmakers. She was a seamstress, modest, hard-working, invisible to those who saw only status. But it was precisely her quiet presence and consistent routine that placed her in a unique position, a witness to the subtle horrors that unfolded behind the stone walls of St. Mary's Academy. She delivered linens, repaired uniforms, and provided hand-sewn garments for the students, all under contract from Victoria Fairfax. And in this capacity, Mrs. Thornton had weekly access to the academy's grounds, just enough to observe what others could not, or refused to. Her cottage sat at the base of Beacon Hill within view of the academy's eastern side, including the little-used side entrance that led directly to the third floor's so-called meditation chambers. At first, she noticed nothing amiss. The academy bustled with the expected rhythm of a schoolgirls marching in rows, hymns drifting from chapel windows, Victoria Fairfax delivering morning devotions in her signature black silk. But that changed on a grey October morning in 1812. Abigail had risen early to deliver a set of wool cloaks for winter. Her arrival was earlier than expected. What she saw haunted her for years. Several gentlemen, well-dressed, purposeful, and clearly of status, were leaving the academy through the side door. Their movements were furtive, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their carriages waiting silently at the edge of the property. They were not teachers nor visiting clergy. Something about their presence felt wrong, out of rhythm with the wholesome image the academy so carefully projected. They exited swiftly, their heads lowered as if emerging from something not sacred, but shameful. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Thornton began to take note of patterns. The visitors always came at night. The carriages, black, unmarked, expensive, would arrive after sundown and remain until long after curfew. Sometimes 1, sometimes 6, and always through the same side entrance. She never saw them enter the main building. She never saw them greeted. It was as if they belonged to a different dimension of the academy, one cloaked in secrecy. But even more unsettling were the changes she observed in the girls. The lively students who had once smiled and waved during her deliveries became distant, sullen, hollow-eyed. Through the tall chapel windows, she'd catch glimpses of them seated in rows during service, their faces pale and unreadable. They moved slowly, as if submerged in molasses, and bore marks that could not be explained by schoolyard tumbles, bruises on their forearms, bandaged wrists, eyes swollen not from illness, but from tears. Margaret Sullivan, the red-haired girl who had once peppered Abigail with questions about tailoring and stories from the town, now averted her gaze, her hair dull and unkempt. Her posture had changed. She no longer stood tall, but hunched as if trying to disappear into herself. Her eyes, once filled with spark, now conveyed a silent scream, a desperate plea for help she could not voice. Mrs. Thornton tried to rationalize her observations. Perhaps the girls were homesick. Perhaps the school was strict, but her instincts screamed otherwise. She had seen sorrow before. She had buried 2 sons. She knew the difference between sadness and despair. And what she witnessed at St. Mary's was despair, worn in silence by girls too afraid or too broken to speak. It wasn't until December 13th, 1812, however, that her fears solidified into horror. That night, unable to sleep from a cough, she saw flickering lights in the chapel windows, erratic not like candlelight, but like torches or firelight. Then she heard it, muffled screams rising and falling like waves of agony. She pressed her face against the cold glass of her kitchen window and stared at the academy's silhouette. Shadows moved behind stained glass. The cries continued for nearly an hour. Then silence. Deafening, haunting silence. 3 days later, she learned that young Hannah Whitmore had died suddenly during the night of December 13th. The official explanation, a fever. The funeral was swift, private, attended only by faculty and students. Mrs. Thornton was not invited, but she heard the hymns carried on the wind songs of mourning sung in voices that sounded more like fear than grief. It was the beginning of a pattern, a quiet extermination of the voiceless and Mrs. Thornton, powerless though she was, began to write everything down. Her needlework had stitched countless seams, but now her pen would begin to stitch together a truth too horrifying to be ignored. A pattern of deaths and a growing dread. What had begun as an isolated tragedy soon unfolded into a quiet epidemic at St. Mary's Academy. One cloaked in respectability, explained away with clinical detachment, and buried alongside the girls it claimed. Following the mysterious death of young Hannah Whitmore in December 1812, the Academy maintained its well-polished facade. Victoria Fairfax wore mourning black, her voice somber but composed as she explained to the townsfolk that the girl had succumbed to fever. The ceremony was tasteful, the death mourned with hymns. But for Mrs. Abigail Thornton, who watched from the shadows of Beacon Hill, something about it all felt deeply wrong. Over the following months, her unease solidified into dread. The girls she glimpsed through the Academy's windows were not just grieving, they were deteriorating. They moved slower, their faces paler, their energy dimmed. What once looked like adolescent fatigue now resembled physical and psychological collapse. Mrs. Thornton took note of which girls showed the most disturbing signs, and a pattern began to emerge. A pattern impossible to dismiss as coincidence. It was always the charity girls, the orphans, the ones without fathers to write letters or mothers to visit on Sundays, the girls whose names would not echo through drawing rooms or courtrooms if something were to happen. The wealthier students, those whose tuition helped fund the institution, seemed tired, yes, but never near the edge of death. Their cheeks held more color, their steps retained strength. Meanwhile, the others faded like ghosts inside their gray uniforms, vanishing piece by piece behind polite smiles and well-rehearsed prayers. In February of 1813, the silence was broken by death again, twice in 1 week. First was Priscilla Morse, the quiet girl with a love for books and a mind full of questions. One morning, she simply did not rise from her bed. She had passed in the night, the Academy said, peacefully and painlessly. 3 days later, Mary Catherine O'Brien, another orphaned student, died in what was labeled a brain fever marked by seizures and hallucinations. Neither girl had shown signs of any serious illness in the days leading up to their deaths. No investigation followed. No questions were asked. It helped that Dr. Edmund Fairfax, cousin to Victoria, and Bartholomew, was both the school's physician and the district coroner. He certified each death as natural, complete with a flourish of medical jargon and a tone of unimpeachable authority. For those not paying attention, the narrative was sound. Sickly girls traumatized by early hardship had succumbed to the strain of rigorous education, a regrettable but understandable reality. But Mrs. Thornton was paying attention, and she was not the only one. By spring, the Academy had lost 3 students in less than 4 months. Still, the institution carried on. Victoria Fairfax gave weekly sermons about sacrifice and the trials of the righteous. She spoke of hardship as a necessary crucible and of death as God's test for the worthy. To her audience, Salem's upper crust and clergy, her words were balm. To the girls of the Academy, they were prophecy. Margaret Sullivan, once full of hope, now drifted through corridors like a living spectre. The fire in her green eyes had dimmed, and the color of her once vibrant hair seemed to have leached away with her spirit. She said little. She smiled even less. But she watched, and she remembered. Mrs. Thornton, still just a seamstress, now found herself holding a terrible knowledge this was not a tragedy. This was a system, a deliberate, methodical elimination of the powerless. And the deeper the silence grew around her, the louder her conviction became. Something had to be done. But how does one expose evil when it wears the robes of virtue, speaks with the authority of religion, and buries its crimes beneath stone crosses and pious hymns? The answers she feared would require a kind of bravery she had not yet imagined, and it would be the girls themselves, those who remained, that would soon take the first impossible step. Margaret's awakening, quiet resistance. By the spring of 1813, Margaret Sullivan was no longer the bright-eyed, flame-haired girl who had once stepped into St. Mary's Academy with hope clutched tightly in her chest like a keepsake. At just 15, she had become something different, older than her years, more silent than her age should permit. Her voice had faded, her posture stiffened, and her expressions were studied masks. But beneath the veneer of compliance, Margaret's mind remained alert, calculating, and most dangerously unbroken. She had survived 3 classmates' deaths. She had watched their deterioration, noted the changes in their behavior, and absorbed their absences like a wound. And though she knew fear intimately by now, she also knew something else: the Academy had made a mistake. They had left her alive long enough to notice the pattern. Her resistance began not with defiance, but with observation. She had learned that asking questions resulted in punishment. Expressing sorrow led to isolation, but watching, that was still allowed. And so she watched, carefully, methodically. She noticed that the girls who vanished, Priscilla, Mary Catherine, Hannah, had all been selected for special instruction prior to their deaths. These sessions took place after dinner when most of the school was quiet, and always in the third-floor meditation chambers where no other students or faculty were allowed. The girls would return hours later, walking like sleepwalkers, often with trembling limbs and vacant eyes. She connected the timing of these sessions to something else: the arrival of unmarked carriages, always after sunset, always through the side gate. The girls selected for instruction matched the nights when those mysterious visitors appeared. Margaret tracked them in her head, counting how many carriages, noting how long they stayed, and remembering which girls climbed those stairs sometimes to descend hours later, as shells of themselves, sometimes never to return at all. More troubling still were the symptoms these girls developed in the days following their sessions: persistent nausea, violent headaches, sudden weight loss, memory fog, and tremors, symptoms that bore an eerie resemblance to Evangeline Fairfax's own nervous condition. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, of course, dismissed it all as spiritual sensitivity. He claimed the girls' souls were awakening, shedding their earthly weights. But Margaret had seen enough of the world before the Academy to recognize what others didn't dare say aloud: they were being drugged. She became an unofficial leader among the remaining orphans, teaching them to communicate through subtle nods, coded glances, or whispered fragments during supervised sewing circles. They could no longer rely on voice, so they built a secret language of survival. Margaret used her seniority and obedient reputation to avoid suspicion. But every day she was building something behind her silent gaze: a map of the Academy's darkness, and a plan to survive it. She knew they couldn't escape through strength; they were too weak, too watched. But perhaps through information they could find a way out, or at least expose the truth before the Academy consumed them all. If they were going to die, they would not die unheard. Margaret had begun to record what she could in her mind: names, dates, symptoms, rituals. She didn't yet know how or when the time would come, but she was certain it would. And when it did, she vowed that anyone would finally listen. Because in a place where virtue was weaponized and innocence was currency, the only path left was resistance. Quiet, patient, relentless. The unexpected ally, Miss Constance Hartwell. In the autumn of 1813, when the leaves had just begun to turn and Salem's harbor mist drifted quietly over Beacon Hill, St. Mary's Academy welcomed a new face. She did not arrive in silence or secrecy, but with a letter of introduction, a firm handshake, and an education most women of her time could only dream of. Her name was Miss Constance Hartwell, and from the moment she stepped through the wrought iron gates of the academy, something subtle shifted. She was not a student. She was not a Fairfax. She was not beholden to the hidden order already in place. She was an anomaly. And for the first time, Margaret Sullivan dared to hope that someone might finally see the truth. Constance was 24, the daughter of a prosperous Boston merchant. Her father had reluctantly permitted her to pursue formal studies, first in Massachusetts, then at Miss Willard's Female Seminary in Troy, New York, a place known for fostering independent thought and the radical idea that women could be more than wives or caretakers. Constance had flourished in that environment, surrounded by critical thinkers and ambitious educators. So when she accepted a position at St. Mary's Academy, it was with a blend of idealism and practicality. The salary was generous. The mission educating disadvantaged girls aligned with her values. What she did not know, however, was that she had just walked into one of the darkest undercurrents of New England's educational elite. Almost immediately she sensed something was wrong. The students, while intelligent, responded to her lessons with unnatural stillness. When she asked questions meant to spark curiosity, the girls recited facts by rote their voices, flat, their eyes blank. They flinched at casual praise and remained unnaturally silent, even when gently encouraged to speak freely. To Constance, who had taught in livelier, more progressive environments, this was not discipline. It was suppression. Something or someone had taught these girls that thinking for themselves was dangerous. At first she attributed this to the Academy's conservative religious culture, but soon cracks appeared in that assumption. She was told the third floor was off limits to all faculty except the Fairfax family. When she requested to use a meditation room for private tutoring, Victoria, Fairfax responded with such pointed resistance couched in silky spiritual language that Constance's suspicions deepened. That floor, Victoria had said, is consecrated space. It is reserved for advanced spiritual instruction. Secular matters must not intrude. But it wasn't until she encountered Margaret Sullivan that everything began to change. It happened one stormy evening as Constance returned late from the library. She saw a figure in white moving down the hallway, Margaret dressed in a gown that resembled not a uniform, but a ceremonial shroud. The girl paused at the side entrance and pressed her ear to the door, listening for something on the other side. Constance did not call out. She watched Hidden Heart racing. When Margaret turned and saw her, both froze. In that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding. They were both watchers, both outsiders in their own way, and both now implicated in something they could no longer ignore. The next day, Margaret stayed after Constance's class. Under the guise of reviewing arithmetic, she whispered, I have things to tell you, but not here. Not now. What followed was a slow, careful unraveling of truths so horrifying that even Constance, raised among skeptics and scholars, struggled to accept them. Margaret spoke of rituals, of drugged tea, of late-night visitors, of girls who faded until they died, and of ledgers kept in coded script detailing the preferences of clients and the progress of victims. Constance listened, her spine rigid, her mind racing. She knew immediately Margaret wasn't delusional. Her recollections were too structured, too detailed, and far too consistent with the unease Constance herself had felt since her arrival. In that hour, a partnership was born, fragile, secret, and necessary. Constance had access, Margaret had knowledge. Together, they would try to expose the horror within St. Mary's Academy, but they also understood this truth: those who hunt monsters must do so in the shadows. Go quietly, because monsters, when well-dressed and well-connected, do not secret files and coded ledgers. The evidence emerges. Once the alliance between Margaret Sullivan and Miss Constance Hartwell was forged, it didn't take long for theory to give way to proof. If there had been any doubt in Constance's mind about the magnitude of what Margaret described, it was quickly extinguished by what they discovered together, buried not in whispers, but in ink. Like the girls themselves, the evidence had been hidden in plain sight, disguised by structured discipline and the illusion of spiritual rigor. But inside the Academy's locked drawers, behind its polished veneer of virtue, lay records so damning they would not only confirm Margaret's worst fears, but reveal a system of exploitation far more organized and horrifying than she had imagined. The plan began with opportunity. As an instructor, Constance was granted limited access to Victoria Fairfax's office for the purpose of grading and preparing lesson plans. The room was austere, impeccably maintained, and lined with devotional texts and academic ledgers. But beneath this surface order were drawers locked with precision and care. Fortunately, Margaret had spent her early childhood surviving on the streets of Salem before she was rescued by the Academy. Among her many survival skills was the ability to pick a lock quietly, quickly, and without trace. On the designated evening, under the guise of reviewing final exams, Constance unlocked the office door, while Margaret slipped inside unseen through the service corridor. Working together under dim lamplight, they opened drawers and began reviewing the contents. At first, what they found seemed mundane attendance charts, lesson rosters, notes from parents. But then they uncovered a compartment beneath the lowest drawer. Within it were the true records, a series of hand-stitched ledgers written in a tightly controlled script, each line a surgical record of human degradation. The entries were coded, but the structure was clear. Each student had an assigned number. Margaret, for example, was Subject 12, MS Red-Green Age, 15. The notes beside her name chilled her to the bone, conditioning progressing slowly. Resistance above average. Recommend increased dosage and extended isolation periods. Client interest moderate but consistent. Estimated transition to final phase 3-4 months. There was no mention of her intellect, her character, or her performance in studies, only her resistance, her market value, and the timeline for her conversion into usable inventory. The girls were not students. They were products reduced to traits, preferences, and profitability projections. The more they read, the worse it became. Some entries described physical preferences of clients, hair color, body type, age range. Others included chilling euphemisms like docility, index response to sedation, and emotional flattening success rate. The coded assessments were disturbingly clinical, as if the girls were livestock being readied for auction, not human beings under the care of a religious institution. But it was the letters that proved the most damning of all. Stored in a separate folio were handwritten correspondences, some bearing wax seals between Victoria Fairfax and clients identified only by initials and titles. One letter, dated November 15, 1813, read, "My dear friend, the young lady you inquired about has shown remarkable progress. Temperament issues have been largely resolved through our specialized instruction methods. I believe she will meet your exacting standards within the fortnight. Your usual contribution of $200 will be most gratefully received. Discretion, as always, is assured." The language was refined, but the meaning was unmistakable. This was not education. It was procurement, a highly organized and lucrative trafficking operation conducted under the shroud of faith and the silence of fear. Constance sat back, hands trembling, a sickness rising in her throat. Margaret, clutching her own file, didn't speak. She didn't have to. They both knew now that the Academy's evil was not just in its cruelty, it was in its order. Every punishment had purpose. Every death had a dollar value. Every prayer whispered in the chapel was a veil drawn over systematic abuse sanctioned by wealth, status, and power. And the Fairfax family wasn't alone. They had clients, they had partners, they had protection. And now Constance and Margaret had something else, evidence. But with that evidence came a terrible burden, because to possess it meant they were no longer just victims or witnesses. They were now a threat. And in a place like St. Mary's, threats did not go unpunished. The night of February 8th. By the start of February 1814, Constance Hartwell and Margaret Sullivan understood the scale of the conspiracy they faced. They had uncovered ledgers, letters, codes, all undeniable proof of an institution that masked ritual abuse as spiritual refinement. But it wasn't enough. The documents were damning, but words on paper could be twisted, dismissed, called forgery. They needed something irrefutable, witnessed firsthand. Constance, though increasingly aware of the danger, resolved to do the unthinkable, infiltrate one of the special instruction sessions and see the truth for herself. If the written records were the skeleton of the horror, then the ritual itself would be its living, breathing face. The opportunity came on February 8th. Margaret, through her network of whispers and hidden glances, had learned that a large gathering was scheduled for that night. 6 girls had been selected, including herself and several others who had already begun to show signs of physical and mental decline. The clients, always shadowed in secrecy, would arrive after dark. Margaret would be present inside the chamber. Constance would hide and watch. The plan was precise. That evening, Constance claimed illness and retired to her quarters early, requesting solitude to recover. At 8:30, once the academy had quieted and the students were confined to their dormitories, she slipped through the servants' staircase, her footsteps silent against the wood. She carried no candle, only a small lantern wrapped in cloth, and the resolve of someone who knew this might be her last chance to make a difference or even survive. The 3rd floor was dimly lit with flickering oil lamps. A sickly sweet scent clung to the air, familiar and nauseating. It reminded Constance of laudanum, or perhaps something worse. She reached the storage closet she had chosen during a previous inspection and climbed atop a crate to access a small ventilation grate. Through its slats, she could see directly into the main chamber. At precisely 9 hour, the ritual began. Evangeline Fairfax entered first, her delicate frame cloaked in ceremonial black, carrying a silver tray with 6 porcelain cups, each filled with a dark liquid that glinted in the candlelight. Bartholomew followed, dressed in long ecclesiastical robes, adorned with strange symbols that bore no resemblance to Christian iconography. His presence filled the room like a shadow that swallowed the light. And then came Victoria. She wore not her usual mourning black, but a regal gown of deep violet, trimmed in gold thread, the bodice embroidered with arcane glyphs. Her face, always composed, now bore the expression of a high priestess, serene, focused, utterly in control. If Constance had not already known the truth, she might have mistaken her for a woman of divine authority. But what she witnessed next removed all illusions. The 6 girls were led into the chamber. All wore flowing white gowns. They moved slowly as if drugged arms, slack eyes half-lidded. Margaret was among them. Her face was pale, but her eyes, though dulled, still held flickers of awareness. The girls were arranged in a circle around a raised platform. Victoria stood at its center, reciting phrases in a language Constance did not recognize. The cadence was rhythmic, almost musical, and Evangeline's haunting soprano wove through the air, singing verses that seemed to deepen the trance. Then the clients entered. 6 men, well-dressed, their shoes polished, their coats tailored. Constance recognized 3 of them, a state legislator, a prominent Salem merchant, and a judge who had once been praised for his moral convictions. They took their seats around the circle, watching in silence as Bartholomew led the girls through a series of ritualistic gestures, kneeling, bowing, drinking from the porcelain cups. What followed could only be described as a ceremony of orchestrated violation. Constance watched in silent horror as the girls were touched, positioned, and spoken to, as if they were objects, not human beings. The men participated under the direction of Bartholomew, who called out verses like an MC while Evangeline continued her song, no longer beautiful, but sickening. The abuse was not wild or chaotic. It was clinical, structured, choreographed like a mass twisted into blasphemy. Through the grate, Constance could see Margaret trembling, her fingers curled against the floor. Yet she remained upright, conscious, enduring. Whether through will or some divine grace, she remained aware, bearing witness with Constance, bound together by silence and strength. When the ritual ended, the clients left through the side entrance, their coats immaculate, their faces calm. The girls were helped away by Evangeline and Victoria, their bodies limp, their eyes vacant. Constance remained hidden in the closet, too paralyzed to move. She had come for proof, and she had found it proof that defied reason, shattered faith, and demanded justice. But as she crouched in the darkness, her breath shallow, one truth echoed louder than all. The Fairfax family was not simply conducting abuse. They were performing something older, colder, something that sought to transform suffering into sacred offering. And unless they were stopped, more girls would be offered in the name of power, disguised as piety. The next phase had begun. The final confrontation was drawing near. Betrayal or sacrifice. The morning after the ritual, Constance Hartwell awoke to sunlight that felt intrusive, almost blasphemous given what she had witnessed the night before. She'd returned to her quarters just before dawn, her heart still pounding, the images burned into her mind like ash on parchment. But as the routine of the academy resumed, the chiming of bells, the rustling of uniforms, the chanting of morning hymns, Constance knew everything had changed. She had seen the truth. Now she needed to act on it. But how does one fight an empire so carefully constructed, so deeply entrenched in power, with only a handful of papers and a traumatized girl as allies? The answer came, as it often does in stories like these, wrapped in treachery, or what appeared to be treachery. On the morning of February 14th, 1814, St. Valentine's Day, Constance awoke to find a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was unmistakably Victoria's, poised, elegant, decisive. It read, "Miss Hartwell, please join me in my office immediately after morning chapel. We have urgent matters to discuss regarding your future at this institution." The tone was superficially polite, but Constance understood the subtext. They knew. Somehow, some way, her clandestine investigation had been discovered. Whether it was a misplaced note, a whisper overheard, or simply the heightened paranoia of the Fairfax family, it didn't matter now. She was exposed. She dressed with trembling hands and attended chapel, scanning the rows of students for Margaret. There she was present, but clearly not herself. Her movements were slow, her pupils dilated, her posture unsteady. And when their eyes met briefly, Constance saw something chilling: resignation. Margaret knew too. They had been found out. After the service, Constance walked to Victoria's office with the calm of a woman walking toward the gallows. She expected accusations, interrogation, perhaps even drugging. What she didn't expect was betrayal. Waiting in the room were Victoria and Bartholomew, flanked by two unfamiliar, broad-shouldered men, undoubtedly enforcers. Victoria, as composed as ever, gestured for her to sit. She opened a leather folder and slowly removed several item sketches of the third floor's layout, copies of coded ledger entries, and worst of all, pages of Constance's own notes written in her distinctive hand. "You seem surprised," Victoria said, her voice honeyed with menace. "Did you really think your little espionage project could escape notice in a place where we control every breath, every glance, every word?" Constance could barely speak. How had they found these documents? Who had betrayed her? Bartholomew answered that unspoken question with devastating finality. "Miss Sullivan has been most cooperative," he said, a smirk creeping onto his gaunt face. "She told us everything, your movements, your findings, your plans." The world tilted. Margaret, no. It couldn't be. She had risked everything. She had witnessed it all. She had survived longer than anyone. Yet the evidence was here. Her silence in chapel, the note, her distant stare, they all now seemed like the signs of a girl who had broken under pressure, who had chosen survival over loyalty, who had perhaps given them up to save herself. Victoria leaned in, her voice lowering. "You're in a precarious position, Miss Hartwell. On the one hand, your father is a respected merchant. Your disappearance would be unfortunate. On the other, your continued existence poses an unacceptable risk. But there is a third option." She offered it like a gift. Join them. Use her education, her connections, her composure to help manage operations in other cities. You'd be well compensated, she purred. And well protected. It was a false choice. Agree and become complicit. Refuse and die. There was no middle ground. Constance said nothing, her mind spinning, trying to buy time. But before she could formulate a response, the silence was shattered by a commotion outside the office. Raised voices. Heavy boots, the unmistakable sound of doors being thrown open, the office door burst inward. Uniformed men of the Massachusetts State Constabulary poured in, led by a tall officer with a commanding presence. Victoria Fairfax. He announced, "You are under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder." And behind him, disheveled but alive, stood Margaret Sullivan, eyes blazing, voice steady. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Constance as Victoria was restrained. "I had to let them believe I'd broken. It was the only way. The betrayal had never happened. It had been a sacrifice." The raid and arrest. It happened in seconds, yet the consequences would echo for generations. The door to Victoria Fairfax's office stood splintered open as the Massachusetts State Constabulary flooded into the room. The ornate rug muffled the boots of justice as officers moved quickly and efficiently, securing Victoria, Bartholomew, and Evangeline Fairfax under arrest. The silence that had ruled St. Mary's Academy for over 2 years, crafted by threat, sedation, and fear, was finally broken by the voices of lawmen reading charges that struck like thunder in the sanctified halls. Conspiracy, kidnapping, abuse, murder. Victoria, for the first time in her carefully curated life, lost her composure. "This is preposterous," she cried, her voice rising into something shrill and unfamiliar. "This institution is protected under Commonwealth Charter. You have no authority here." Her signature grace crumbled under the weight of reality. She reached for papers, for her mask of righteous indignation, for anything to maintain the illusion that had protected her for so long. But the constables were unmoved. "We have sworn testimony," the lead officer replied coldly, "and evidence enough to fill a courthouse. You will come with us, peacefully or not." And then came Margaret. Her hair was still damp from the rain, her dress wrinkled, and her eyes, those emerald eyes that had once danced with innocence, now burned with the defiance of someone who had risen from the ashes of horror and chosen courage. She crossed the threshold, slowly, locking eyes with Constance, who was still seated, stunned, her mind catching up with the truth. "I couldn't tell you," Margaret said, voice shaking but firm. "When they took me 2 nights ago, I knew they were watching every move. So I told them what they wanted to hear. I pretended to break. But I got out. I used the side gate. I made it to Salem's constabulary before sunrise." She had risked everything. Her survival had not been cowardice, it had been calculation. While Victoria and Bartholomew believed they had shattered her will, Margaret had used their arrogance against them. She fed them half-truths, staged her own obedience, and slipped through the academy's cracks just long enough to bring everything crashing down. The officers didn't come empty-handed. Margaret had not only delivered testimony, but hard evidence, names, ledger entries, ritual schedules, and, most critical, a list of prominent clients who were expected at the academy that very night. Judges, legislators, businessmen, men whose power had insulated them for decades. Now their anonymity was gone. The law was coming for them too. In the hours that followed, the network of horror unraveled with shocking speed. Officers were dispatched across Salem and Boston, arresting men who once dined with governors and gave sermons from pulpits. Dr. Edmund Fairfax was apprehended at his private clinic. The Academy's personal archives were seized, and interviews with surviving students began under protection. The institution that had once been untouchable was now a crime scene. But one of the most unexpected heroes of the hour was Abigail Thornton, the seamstress. The one who had watched, documented, and been dismissed for over a year. When investigators interviewed her, they discovered she had kept a private journal meticulous and unwavering recording. The comings and goings of visitors, changes in student behavior, flickers of light in chapel windows, and the physical decline of girls she had known by name. Her records provided a third voice, independent and concrete, that verified both Constance's documents and Margaret's testimony. The academy, once revered as a sanctuary of learning and virtue, was now viewed with horror. Inside its elegant architecture had existed a dark enterprise structured sacred and predatory. The same building that had echoed with hymns now echoed with chains and condemnation. Margaret and Constance stood side by side as the Fairfax family was led away in shackles. The nightmare, while far from over, was finally exposed to the daylight. And for the first time since arriving at St. Mary's, the girls who remained dared to breathe. Public reckoning. The trial of Victoria. Bartholomew and Evangeline Fairfax began in the fall of 1814, but the tremors of its approach were felt across the entirety of New England, long before the courtroom doors ever opened. It was no longer a local scandal, nor merely a tragic tale of institutional abuse. It had become a national sensation, a reckoning that dragged powerful men and religious authorities from the safety of their pulpits and private clubs into the cold light of judicial scrutiny. Reporters from Boston, New York, and even London descended upon the Salem courthouse. Pamphlets were printed, sermons were revised, and the streets swelled with citizens who demanded to know how such horrors could have flourished under the guise of Christian education. Victoria Fairfax, the architect of the academy, refused to bow her head. Clad in her familiar black silk, she carried herself with the same composed arrogance she had once used to pacify governors and priests. Her defense, rehearsed and polished, was that she had been a victim herself, manipulated by clients, deceived by her family, and overpowered by a system of patriarchal influence. She tried to paint herself as a misguided reformer, a woman of virtue caught in a web spun by others. But her own letters, journals, and records betrayed her. Her handwriting on contracts, her explicit orders regarding drug dosages and student conditioning, and the systematic nature of her correspondence with clients left no room for ambiguity. She had not been deceived. She had been the mastermind. Bartholomew Fairfax, ever the preacher, adopted a different approach. He claimed the rituals performed in the third-floor chambers were misunderstood. Religious ecstasy, he called it. Spiritual purification. He even produced twisted theological texts, self-authored, arguing that the girls' suffering was part of their salvation. But the court was unmoved. His descriptions bore no resemblance to any accepted Christian doctrine. Cross-examinations revealed that the language he had used was deliberately constructed to give psychological cover to acts of ritual abuse. He was not guiding souls toward heaven. He was delivering bodies to the highest bidder. The most tragic figure among the accused was Evangeline Fairfax. By the time she stood before the court, medical examinations had revealed that she had been under the influence of narcotics, primarily laudanum, for more than a decade. Her mind had fractured under constant sedation and psychological manipulation. Testimonies from students confirmed that she had participated in ceremonies and sang during acts of abuse, but always with a far-off look in her eyes, a voice that never trembled. She remembered very little. Her condition rendered her legally incompetent to stand trial, and she was instead committed to a sanatorium, her fate quietly buried by the state. The trial also implicated more than just the Fairfax family. The seized documents named dozens of clients, judges, ministers, and legislators. Some were arrested. Others, protected by influence or quick enough to flee, disappeared from public life. A few died by suicide before they could be brought to court. Careers collapsed. Congregations disbanded. The facade of moral authority that had protected these men was shattered, and the public, once quick to revere, now demanded blood for betrayal. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, the family physician and official coroner of the Academy, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for falsifying death records and enabling the continued abuse through his medical authority. Several other physicians exposed through the investigation lost their licenses or faced legal action for participating in similar schemes elsewhere. The scandal served as a warning to the entire medical profession. Prestige would no longer protect those who colluded in silence. Victoria and Bartholomew were both sentenced to death by hanging, an execution that drew over 2,000 spectators. For Victoria, it was a grim irony. The woman who once spoke of salvation and obedience was now marched to the gallows not as a martyr, but as a symbol of justice. Her composure, legendary in the courtroom, finally cracked as the noose was placed around her neck. Bartholomew said nothing as he died, perhaps for the first time in his life. And as the bodies were buried and the headlines faded, what remained was not just the memory of evil, but a public demand for reform. The Academy was demolished, the land converted into a public park, and the children once deemed expendable were finally given something more powerful than pity recognition. But the most enduring legacy would not be the trial or the executions. It would be the quiet power of two women who refused to stay silent: reform, remembrance, and justice. In the aftermath of the Fairfax trial, as the press found new stories and the public's shock turned into silent contemplation, something remarkable began to take root. Not vengeance, but reform. The horror of St. Mary's Academy had exposed a rot that ran deeper than one institution. It had shown how virtue could be used as camouflage, how religious authority could become a shield for abuse, and how the most vulnerable poor girls without families were always the first to be sacrificed and the last to be believed. But from this devastation, something different emerged, a collective resolve to ensure that such atrocities would never happen again. The physical site of St. Mary's Academy was razed in the summer of 1815. The once grand Georgian mansion with its looming gables and blood-soaked chapel was dismantled stone by stone. The materials were auctioned off, and the proceeds were placed into a fund established to compensate surviving victims and the families of the deceased. In place of the building, a modest public park was created, a quiet green space that overlooked Salem Harbor, where gulls now replaced the shadows that once watched from shuttered windows. At its heart stood a simple monument, a stone obelisk engraved with 43 names. Beneath them, one line: "They were forgotten by the world, but not by history." The monument was funded not by the state, but by donations from ordinary people across New England, many of whom had once admired the Academy. Their contributions were an acknowledgement, a quiet act of penance for having looked away too long. But the impact of St. Mary's did not end in stone and soil. The political fallout sparked sweeping educational reforms in Massachusetts, which would later influence national standards. the state became the first in the country to mandate regular inspections of all schools, particularly those that housed orphans or impoverished children. These inspections included unannounced visits, student interviews, and mandatory documentation that could no longer be sealed behind private religious charters. Background checks for instructors, oversight committees, and publicly accessible records became standard practice. Most significantly, the legislature passed what became known as the Sullivan-Hartwell Act, named in honor of the two women who had exposed the Academy's horrors. The act required that any institution receiving state funds or charitable exemptions must employ third-party monitors unaffiliated with the school's governing body. This act would later become a cornerstone in the formation of the modern Department of Education's child protection policies. Margaret Sullivan, once an orphan, with nothing but a sharp mind and the will to survive, became a national figure. But she did not use her fame for comfort. Instead, she founded the Haven School for Girls in Boston, a tuition-free institution that offered real education, medical care, and protection for those deemed unfit for society. Over 3 decades, the Haven educated hundreds of girls, many of whom became teachers, nurses, writers, and advocates in their own right. Margaret never married, though. Suitors came and went. She said once in an interview, "The only vow I ever took was to make sure no girl is ever silenced again." Constance Hartwell returned to Boston and married a fellow educator who'd stood beside her during the legislative fight for reform. Together, they opened the Elm Street Academy, an experimental school that championed critical thinking, open inquiry, and student voice, a radical notion in its time. Constance dedicated the remainder of her life to teacher training and institutional transparency, ensuring that no one in her profession could ever again claim ignorance as an excuse for silence. And yet perhaps the most profound legacy of the St. Mary's tragedy was philosophical rather than procedural. The scandal changed how society viewed respectability itself. It taught a hard truth that status and virtue are not the same, that a black silk dress and a well-written sermon can hide monstrous intent, and that protecting children requires not just policies but vigilance, courage, and the willingness to listen when their voices tremble with fear. For years afterward, survivors of St. Mary's would quietly place flowers at the park's monument on the anniversary of its closing. They came not to relive their trauma, but to reclaim their names, their memories, and their right to be remembered as more than victims. They had once been told their suffering was spiritual. Now the world knew the truth. The story of St. Mary's became required reading in seminaries and law schools alike. A cautionary tale, a rallying cry, a reminder that evil does not always come dressed as a monster. Sometimes it arrives singing hymns. Their voices still echo. More than 2 centuries have passed since the last hymn was sung inside St. Mary's Academy, and yet the echoes have never fully faded. They linger not in the form of crumbling buildings or forgotten relics, but in testimonies, reforms, and the quiet, enduring presence of memory. For the girls who suffered and died behind those stone walls, justice came too late. But memory, that sacred force that defies decay, refused to let them vanish. Their voices, once stifled by laudanum and ritual, now rise with a clarity that history cannot ignore. Margaret Sullivan once testified with remarkable composure before the court, but her most powerful words were not for the judges. They were for the world. They thought we were powerless because we were poor, because we were young, because we were alone. They thought they could use us and discard us without consequence because no one would believe our word against theirs. But they forgot even the powerless can find power when they stand together for truth. Those words would be carved into bronze and mounted beneath the memorial at the park where St. Mary's once stood. Generations of visitors, parents, students, advocates have stood before them silent. Many bring flowers, some weep, some walk away changed. The legacy of the Academy is a complex one. It is a story of horror, yes, but also of resistance, of a seamstress who saw what others would not, of a girl who refused to be broken, of a teacher who risked everything to expose the truth. These were not women of wealth or status. They did not carry weapons or titles. What they carried was conviction and the belief that silence in the face of evil is complicity. Their courage dismantled not only a criminal empire, but an entire cultural assumption that morality and respectability are the same. St. Mary's Academy was revered for its religious piety, its academic excellence, and its pristine discipline. And yet it concealed an industry of torment, so structured, so calculated, it rivaled any underground criminal enterprise in its time. That revelation changed how the public viewed charitable institutions, how governments monitored schools, and how the justice system approached crimes cloaked in virtue. Even today, echoes of the Academy's warning remain painfully relevant. In every scandal where religious institutions are accused of abuse, in every testimony, from survivors who say, "I wasn't believed," the ghost of St. Mary's returns not to haunt, but to remind. Evil, when protected by power and decorum, becomes nearly invisible, and so society must learn not only to question authority, but to protect those without it. In academic institutions around the world, the St. Mary's case is studied not simply for its legal precedent, but for its moral implications. It asks future educators, clergy, politicians, and caretakers one harrowing question: what will you do when righteousness becomes a mask? And in a broader sense, it speaks to us all. Because the story is not just about a school. It is about what happens when silence is enforced, when institutions are worshipped, and when those who cry out are told to whisper or disappear. It's about the cost of looking away. As you walk through that quiet park in Salem, surrounded by trees that have outlived their shadows, you may hear no sound. But the wind, the leaves, the stone, they all carry the same message: remember us. Learn from our sacrifice, and never again allow such horrors to be committed in the name of virtue, education, or faith. The past has lessons still unlearned. Let us be brave enough to listen.